Greetings. This is a video that's been created for senior school students on creating an analytical essay on a text. So in this particular case, we are looking at a year 10 level of writing, and we're looking at the text The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. So I'll just put that information down. Now I'm working on the computer as I'm speaking, so I'm going to be putting some information on the screen as we go. And we're going to be talking through the process of getting ready to create an essay, and we're looking at those first couple of important steps: getting started, planning, and also composing the first part of the essay. So in this particular case, we're going to be working with a specific question, and the question which we're going to do is, in what ways do the fictional races of the Eli and the Morlocks represent an image of humanity? Now, you might have a question similar to this, or you might be in a position where you need to choose your own question, but we're just going to be using what I would say is a fairly directed question in this case, and we're going to essentially build our planning and our structure around this particular point. Now, the first and most important thing before starting to write an essay is that you actually think about what you intend to write about. It seems simple, but a lot of people make this mistake. When this is the case, I tend to create a fairly simple table on the screen, which just looks something like this. I'm just going to go with 5 columns. There's essentially 5 stages to an essay at a year 10 level. I'm going to be creating an introduction. I'm going to be creating the first paragraph. I'm going to be creating paragraph 2 and 3, which I'm just going to paste in just to save a bit of time, and I'm also creating my conclusion. Now, the most important sections in this table are going to be the paragraph ones, and this is essentially where I'm going to start. Essentially, when we're thinking about what goes into a paragraph, we need to think about what we're really trying to analyse and what we're trying to say. Now, in each paragraph, I always say that you need 3 important things to start. You need to have what we call a message, or a theme, or a lesson from within the text. That's the first thing that you need to have. The second thing you need to have is a technique. Now, when we're talking about these things, I should explain in a bit more detail. When I talk about the message, the theme, or the lesson, what we're looking for is something that is within this book that justifies why it was written. Another word for this would be the term author intent. Now, this is a really important part when we're talking about analysis, because the author intent essentially underlines the entire reason that the book exists in the first place. So we have to really think about that. When we think about the technique, it becomes more a question of how. We need to think about how the author has actually managed to communicate that. And the third thing that you need before you start is an example. Okay, you need to think, what example am I actually going to use to back this up? So once I've got that down, those 3 points, I can essentially copy those into my plan. Now, I'm only going to go over the first paragraph with you in terms of my planning, but you should be able to use this process to then create your own version of the second and third paragraph, and you should be able to follow these steps. So, the first thing I'm looking at for the first paragraph, I now go back up to the actual topic itself. Now, really what this is asking me to do is to create a relationship between the fictional race of the Eli and humanity. When we think about H.G. Wells and this particular book, what he was really looking to do was to create an image of humanity, or actually to show us something that was happening within humanity. It wasn't his intention to necessarily make direct predictions about what the future would look like. It's a fictional story, but like most science fiction stories, H.G. Wells is using exaggeration. So in order to show us what's wrong with our own human race, H.G. Wells creates an exaggerated version of a human which only looks at one particular point. Now, when I think about the Eli, and for people who've read the book or can remember the book, you might recognise that the Eli are very beautiful, but they're also very fragile and they have very little, almost childlike intelligence. In fact, the Eli represent almost a version of ourselves, this sense of vanity and beauty and grace, things that we find really very important. But then at the same time, they also show the fact that sometimes people don't value intelligence or challenge or hardship, and that's one of the big messages of this book. So for my message, I'm going to use fairly plain language, but really what I think that they're saying in terms of the Eli, when we think about what they tell us about humanity, really I think about that concept of vanity, vanity being our obsession with appearance, so vanity and appearance. And really I think there's a message is that vanity and appearance, I might put an and in there, vanity and appearance alone are not enough to keep us human. Now that might seem like a bit of a jump from what I was talking about before, but to keep the video moving, I thought I'd give you an example of what a message or something might look like that I draw out. In this case, to explain what I've written, when I think about the Eli, they were very beautiful and very graceful, but ultimately they're not human because they lack the ability to think, to feel, and to make choices. They're essentially a race that has given up their ability to think and feel because they've had life so easy for so long. And out of all of that time, the only part of their humanity that they've preserved is their beautiful appearance and grace, and that alone isn't enough to make them what they should be. So in this case, the message that I've drawn out is that if we focus on only vanity and appearance alone, we lose our humanity. And I think there's something in there about what H.G. Wells was trying to say. As we mentioned before, when we think about a technique, there's a number of different techniques, what we call narrative techniques. Some of those might include things like characterization, which is when you use a particular character to represent a particular message. Another one might be something to do with the use of a setting or the use of something within the story, or a use of a particular device. In this case, the device that I'm going to pick on is that of exaggeration. And like a lot of science fiction texts, exaggeration is really heavy in The Time Machine, and it's because H.G. Wells really tries to show us our problems by exaggerating and escalating them in this fictional setting. But what it's supposed to teach us is the fact that these are versions of our own vanity that exists within us. So of course the technique is the exaggeration, and in this case the example is the Eli. Okay, so the example within the book is the Eli. Now using just these 3 points, this is enough to make a start on my first paragraph, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how these 3 points fit together. Now there's 5 steps to a paragraph, so I'm going to go over those 5 steps and then I'm going to come back up to this and show you how you can actually transfer information from one side to the other, and I'm also going to give you a template that you can use to create your specific paragraph. In the senior school, it's a really important thing that we make sure we cover all the bases in order to have a sufficient level of depth in our analysis. So when we think about the structure of a paragraph, it's important that we make sure that we tick all of these boxes. You might be familiar with this concept of what's called TEEEL, and of course TEEEL is something that's used in a lot of high schools as a method for creating a structured paragraph. However, when we get to a more senior level, what we tend to do to explain the level of depth required is add a couple of E's. So when I work with TEEL, I call it TEEL because I've got, instead of 2 E's, I have 4. And those E's represent, well, firstly the T is the topic sentence, which is a really important thing to have. We then have the elaboration, and the elaboration comes second. We then give the evidence of the point that we're looking to make. And I put this E in especially for senior school students because we often forget this next step, which is what I call the explanation of that evidence. Now usually these two are combined and people assume that you would do one and the other, but I had a huge amount of students who neglected to do this, so I've separated them just to make sure. The next really interesting and important thing is what's called the effect. And the effect is one of those really key points that separates senior school writing from middle school writing. And the reason is because the effect of a message can often be different to what the explanation is. I'll explain that a little bit more in just a moment. The final one is the linking statement, and this is the section that really links everything together. You'll get a better sense of how these particular elements work together when I start to combine them with my examples. Just to give you a quick explanation of the difference between explanation and effect, the key difference is that as we analyse a text, it's important that we think about what the author's intent was. If I use an example, like for example a KFC ad, when I watch an ad for Kentucky Fried Chicken, I can dictate that the author's intent, or the intent of the person who created that ad, wanted me to go to KFC and buy some food. However, what we need to recognise in that higher level of expectation is that the reader in this case, or the viewer or the customer, can often interpret things different to what the intention was. So for example, you could very much want me to come into KFC and buy some chicken, but if I don't like the look of the actors, or I don't like the song, or I don't like the dialogue, it's very likely that my interpretation could be something completely different. Now, drawing these distinctions in a paragraph at the senior level is what makes our writing sophisticated. So that's an important thing to distinguish. Let's look at how we're going to put this together. I'm going to space out these different elements, and you can do this on your page if you're playing along. And I'm going to go up to my plan. Now, essentially that message, that intent, that message, theme, and that lesson is the most important thing that I really need to get out. So that's the thing I'm going to start with, because that's really the guts of everything I'm trying to talk about, is trying to justify this theme. So this is essentially going to become my topic sentence. Okay, I'm going to base my topic sentence around whatever I have identified to be the message. The exaggeration, the technique that I've put in, that's going to become my elaboration. Okay, so I'm going to type that on there. And of course, finally, talking about the Eli within the book, that's going to become my evidence section. Now, I haven't talked about the other two yet, and that's for you to fill in, okay, or you meaning the writer. And that's actually the really interesting guts of the essay, because that's where you actually explain some things to us. But in this case, to get my structure down, I'm starting with this particular point, okay? So using this information, I'm just going to come down, and you can see up the top, I can see the green writing up here, and I can see where the actual topic sentence stuff is. I'm going to put this into a basic sentence. So for my topic sentence, I've said that vanity and appearance alone are not enough to keep us human. So that's going to be the focal point of my topic sentence. When I come down here, I'm actually just going to copy paste that information, and in front of it I'm going to write, in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. Oh, actually, I'm going to change that a little bit. So, how embarrassing. I'm going to say one of the key messages in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine is that vanity and appearance are not enough to keep us human. Fantastic. It's not a perfect sentence in this case. You can see I've got the green stripe. That's never good news. But in this case, you can see how I've taken my list item and I've moved it into creating this topic sentence. So one of the key messages in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine is that vanity and appearance alone are not enough to keep us human. Okay, so I'll stick with that for now. And generally, you come back to the point of doing your editing. I think it's more important to start getting your words down, and we can sort that out later on. I won't go through a grammar lesson straight away. So for my next section, which is my elaboration, I'm now going to focus on the technique that I've identified, which is, in this case, exaggeration. Elaboration, exaggeration. It's easy to get tongue-tied. So in this case, I'm going to write the author uses, I'm going to make sure this is the right colour. Okay. The author uses exaggeration as a means of showing us that. Okay. okay? And I might actually change that to the for now. There's a really key part of language in here that you need to get used to using as a senior school writer, and it's this term the author uses. It's always important to talk about what I call author intent language, and the purpose for this is because it actually shows that this was deliberately done, okay? It shows that the book was written for a specific reason, and it's important to really highlight that. The author uses exaggeration as a means of showing us, okay, the folly of putting all our energy into looking attractive instead of challenging ourselves. Now again, I'm going on my own interpretation of this, but what I've really tried to do is, when I said not enough to keep us human, that sounds a little bit vague. It sounds like maybe we're turning into some kind of alien or something like that, but what I've tried to do here is actually put that into more clarity. He uses exaggeration as a means of showing us the folly of putting all our energy into looking attractive instead of challenging ourselves. That's maybe the message that I think he's trying to put together. I'll move on to my next section, where I now look at the ELI, and simple language to use in this case would be to say, in the text we read, and this would be where I would put in a quote from the book. Now in this particular case, I'm not going to enter the quote. If you're working on an essay, you might have a great one. I would really suggest looking at chapter 4 as a means for doing this. And it might be something, chapter 4 talks about the fact that they're very beautiful but very elegant. It talks about this fact of the time traveller saying things like, are these creatures fools? Or describing their appearance. And really what you're looking to do is prove the fact that the content that you're looking to base your argument on is in the book. If I came up with a crazy message like saying this book is all about staying away from Mars, I would need to show something in the book that has actually triggered that thought. Now, there's a couple of key points to these next sections. I'm not going to go into them in huge detail, but I'm going to show you essentially how this starts. Once you've given your quote, it's important to explain what that means. Okay, so here a good sentence to use would be something like, this content shows us that ... In this case, if I'm using something like a description of the Eli and the fact that they're really beautiful but really frail and not very intelligent, I need to link that back to what I'm actually trying to say about the author's intent. So I could say something like, this content shows us that, if our personalities, I'll give you a bit of an example to get you going, if our personalities are reduced to nothing but appearance and fun, then we cease to exist as human beings and become something much less valuable. Okay, so something like this, and what I've really tried to do is I've tried to use whatever this quote might be to actually really explain what the author is trying to say. I'm not using hugely complicated language. I won't worry about that straight away, but I guess I'm trying to piece some of these pieces together. Now, for this next section, about the reader, about the effect, I think, once again, using simple language to show you where to start, I would say something like, for the reader, okay, this teaches us that. And what you really need to put in this section is what this message means to you. This is about your interpretation. When you hear someone say, we are no longer going to be humans if we focus too much on appearance, the question is, how does this affect your world? What does this teach you? What does it make you think about? What does it make you feel? And the question that you answer in that actually says a lot about the depth of your writing. Now, I'm going to move past that only because the length of this video is getting beyond what I had originally intended, and I'm just going to quickly go into this moment about the linking statement. Now, a really basic linking statement would be something like, here we have shown how, what am I thinking? Wells has used the Eli as a means to demonstrate the weakness of our human nature. Okay, something along that way. What I've really tried to do is sum up everything in just a sentence. And, I've used some really key words. I've made sure I mentioned the Eli, I've mentioned H.G. Wells, and I've mentioned human nature, which is really similar to actually saying humanity, because I want it to have a relationship with that topic. But essentially, this is what your first paragraph or your paragraph should look like. You can see I've left some information for you to actually follow in, and if you can go through and create your next section, so in this case my example is going to be the Morlocks, because I know I have to talk about them. My technique could be anything. Once again, it could be anything from symbolism, it could be about representation, it could be about characterization. There's a whole list of different techniques which you can Google if you're unsure, and then you need to think about what lesson we were taught. And of course, for this next section you might choose to compare the Eli and the Morlocks, or I always suggest it could be really interesting to actually focus on this concept of the time traveller within the book, within himself, because he actually embodies both the Eli and the Morlocks. So hopefully this has given you a bit of an idea about how to start. Remember, create your plan first and then use your plan to then create your paragraphs. We haven't even talked about the introduction or conclusion yet, which follow different settings, but it also goes to show you don't necessarily need to start with your conclusion. You can start putting together the basic parts of your paragraph before you even get into that. So hopefully this has been helpful for you, and please post a comment if you feel like you need further clarification. Thank you.